So here we are, the beginning of a new month, September 6th, 2020, and also the beginning of a new sermon series here at Granger United Methodist Church. I'm Bruce Hartley. I'm the pastor at Granger United to be the pastor of this fine congregation. I'm glad that you're listening. You may be a member here, or maybe you've just found your way onto our website for the first time, or you've found us again, and you're gathering with us to explore faith, maybe get some answers to some questions you've had about God. Either way, you're here, and I'm glad you're here, and I pray that God will bless what I have drafted over this past week, what I've been reflecting on for longer than a week as we prepare this series, and that God will open your ears, your mind, and your heart to this thought along the way. Today is a call to faithfulness. God does a new thing. God does a new thing. God has a way of doing that. But before I tell you what this new thing is that God is doing, I want to share with you, I'll offer you a brief recap of the history of communication since, the beginning. A brief recap of the history of communication since the beginning. A brief recap of the history of communication since the beginning of time. Yep, it's a bold move, and I hope that you can keep up with me on this. And if you need to stop it and restart it to follow along, then you be sure to do it. In the primordial mists of time, there were grunts and moans and inarticulate shouting. Historians and linguists have no idea what all the shouting was about. And then speech was invented. How long ago? A long time ago. And then came ram's horns, through which speech could be shouted and amplified, and then symbols were developed to represent speech and increasingly sophisticated media for its dissemination. There was stone and clay and papyrus and parchment and paper, which in turn were made into tablets and scrolls and incubella. Then came the printing press, which changed everything, igniting revolutions and a major renaissance. Things stayed the same for hundreds of years. And then came the telegraph in 1837, followed by the first commercially successful typewriter in 1868. And then Alexander Graham Bell said, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." Then came, and I share this in chronological order, the phonograph in 1877, the radio in 1895, silent movies in 1915, movies with sound 1927, television 1929, and the cassette tape recorder in 1962. Tape recorder in 1962. Then came children playing in the backyard with 2 empty Campbell's soup cans with a string attached to each. Then came the IBM Select typewriter. And then cordless phones, then computer and software to operate it, and again, everything changed. Then came the internet and the World Wide Web in 1989. And again, everything changed. Then came the Then came the iPhone, 2003, and again, everything changed. At one point, a long time ago, a message could be disseminated only as fast as you could shout or text to anyone, anywhere, at any time. And this is a brief history of communication. Oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Upon further review, I think I need to go back. I think I've done you a disservice. Let's go back, and I'll try to fit this in chronologically. First, long ago, God spoke. God spoke in many and various ways. It says that in Hebrews that I read to you a moment ago. And this divine speech was mediated or mouthed by prophets. God also used angels who were sent to serve, and they were sent, back in the ancient days. God spoke through prophets for a long time and some more angels, and then God spoke through Son. And everything changed. And everything continues to change. Now, I think I've brought you up to speed. I think that's much better and filled in some of the gaps. We must never forget that God does what God does in the history of communication. It is key. It is absolutely key to followers of Christ remaining faithful to God. Christ remaining faithful to God is understanding how God communicates and through whom God communicates. So we launch a new sermon series this week, September 6th, focusing on we will learn how to be faithful, mostly from the New Testament letters of Hebrews and Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy. And today we hear a communication, a letter written to the early church, relating the manner of communication God has adopted. Through the letter of the Hebrews, or to the Hebrews, we read, long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these us by a Son. That's in the first couple verses of the first chapter of Hebrews. God sent Jesus to walk among us and speak to us, to show us God's will and God's way by being in relationship with us. God's will and God's way by being in relationship with us. Jesus is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. That's in verse 3. Now, this may be old hat to your ears, but this, to put it into context of the first century, this was startling new to those reading this. God is doing a new thing. God has spoken to us by a Son. He sustains all things by his powerful word. The word became flesh and lived among us. That is to say, not among us. That is to say, not distant, but with us. Not silent, but speaking to us. Not harsh, but full of grace and truth. evolved in divine communication methods. God, having thrown creation together in the most creative act of communication ever, now does something equally creative. God uses human representatives to speak to their own kind. God sends the Spirit of God upon them. God makes announcements and proclamations, sets boundaries, sets the agenda. In short, God does pretty much everything that can be done to give the human family all that is needed to walk faithfully and humbly, doing what is kind and just. Among these humans is a prophet. His name is Moses. And through Moses, the law of God, creation, and always in the heart and mind of God, was codified and chiseled into stone tablets. And through this prophet, that is Moses, God called out a nation. God called out a nation. God created a community of faith through which God would express God's nature and love. And then another great prophet was Elijah, a prophet who spoke truth, or a prophet in Israel like Elijah. And many other prophets stood in Israel's history to declare the mind of God. There was Nathan and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. There was Daniel and Hosea and Amos and Joel and Habakkuk and others. God spoke through these humans, these prophets. God communicated. God has always been a highly communicative God. God's pattern has not been to withdraw into a God cave and refuse to speak. God has been most gregarious and engaging. God has been highly eager to interact with and connect with us humans. This is not a God who created humans and then left them to fend for themselves. The biblical witness affirms again and again that God relentlessly tried to connect human offspring. And typically, these children, our ancestors of the faith, rebelled. So God tried one more thing. Everything changed. What risk did God take? God becomes a human God, cloaked in human form to live and move. Cloaked in human form to live and move about in human society. Talk about a creative act of communication. Everything changed. The world got turned upside down. God's arrival on planet Earth in a little Jewish settlement south of Jerusalem was the pivotal point in human history. He was known as the Son of God. He was the reflection of God's glory, This Jesus was superior in both his work and being to the prophets, to the created and natural world, and even to the angels in heaven. Jesus was superior to the prophets because the prophets were human, and only human. They were fallible, they were prone to breakdowns, they were prone to tantrums, we can see that several times over. They were prone to confusion, and sometimes even the prophets were prone to rebellion. But not Jesus. Jesus was human, but not just a human. Still, he was a human being, and as such, subject to all the tests, the temptations, and trials human beings suffer. Yet, he was without sin. He was superior even to angelic beings. The angels worshipped him. He did not worship angels. He was present. Heavens were the work of his hands. So, to kind of recap, to wrap up, God is a God who communicates. God is not absent. God is not hidden in a cloud. God will not fit in the boxes created by humanity. It's not like we don't know God's intentions, or it's not like we don't know anything about God. We know a great deal about God. God has communicated in a variety of ways, and the clearest communication has come to us through Jesus Christ. So, I've tried to answer this question of the various letters in the New Testament, and here's the question I pose again to Testament, and here's the question I pose again to you. Why does the writer of Hebrews share this with us? This reality that God communicates in God's own Son. Well, I believe it's so humanity will pay greater attention to God and from the word God shares. So we will not drift away from it. So we will remain faithful to God. To God. Followers of Christ must not, air quote, drift away from what we've been taught. It is so easy to drift. When I thought about this reality of drifting away from what we've been taught, I pictured the rowboat that is on the screen, online anyway, on a beautiful sunny afternoon. The waters are calm. Oh, the kind of day you could just take a nap. You're lying in the rowboat on maybe some cushions. You're on a boat, broad. Maybe it's a river, maybe it's a small pond, or maybe it's a very small, shallow lake. And the rope is just ever so loosely tied to the dock. And then you doze. And the breeze comes, and the continual tug of the current loosens the rope. And after a while, you're out on the river, you're out on the pond, you're out on the lake, you're drifting. And it happens so slow that it's imperceptible. And when you wake up, you're just, I don't know, feet away from danger. If you've been on a river, maybe you're just 60 feet. Yikes! See, this is an image that comes to my mind, or the danger that the writer is trying to communicate to the early church to us. To us. If you need a modern day example, then maybe you want to follow along with Reverend Falwell and the media implosion that has happened. I do not revel in what has happened to this man of God, but he is for me a colleague in ministry. We must remember who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for us. We must not drift away. Jesus is the theological rope that keeps us tethered to the dock of salvation. We must not stray from it, and it being that Jesus is God, that Jesus is God's most evident effort at a revelation of God's self. At a revelation of God's self. And that Jesus is superior to any prior communicative act on behalf of God. This Jesus is above the angels. In short, that Jesus is the exact imprint. And second, we will lose out on so much if we neglect so great a salvation that God has provided for us in Jesus Christ. You see, the writer is concerned. He's concerned about his reader's eternal soul. Not only about the here and now, but about the eternity. He is concerned that any failure to understand the salvific work of Christ on the cross will lead to eternal loss. If we are disconnected from the cross, we lose out on eternity. And after all that God has done to communicate with us, to teach us and to warn us, Jesus, it would be a shame if we should lose out on the joy of our salvation because we are neglecting to heed or to pay greater attention to what we have heard. So faithfulness begins with knowing who Jesus Christ is, the means of our redemption. And when we believe this, everything changes. Everything. I am not aware of who is listening to this call to faithfulness. But it is a call that God will not stop sounding. God sends this message to reconnect. And God longs to reclaim his precious children, of which you and I are numbered among. Dear friends, God is still doing it. God is still doing a new thing. God is still speaking. If you will listen and reconnect, God's newness will be revealed in you. God has done so in my life and in the lives that I have been honored and privileged to walk beside and behind for decades. And I truly believe in what the writer of Hebrews has called for the first generation or the first century, and now this 21st century. This call to faithfulness. I hope that you'll join us in the coming weeks as we continue to pursue a call to faithfulness. All of God's children combined. I can't wait. I can't wait to hear how God has been communicating to you. You can email me, go on and dialogue with the pastor online. I can't wait to hear you describe how God is doing a new thing in your life. Grace and peace to you, my friend.